Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking one of the most chaotic and, influential events in all of world history, the French Revolution. We're going to see how a society built on privilege got completely overthrown, and how the ideas it unleashed, well, they changed the world forever. So let's just dive right into the action. It is July 14th, 1789, and Paris is an absolute powder keg. The king has moved his troops into the city, and rumors are just flying everywhere that he's about to order the army to open fire on the citizens. People are terrified, they're angry, and they know they need to arm themselves. So, a crowd of several hundred people starts marching towards the eastern part of the city. Now, their target isn't just any old building, it's the Bastille, this massive medieval fortress prison. And for the people of Paris, this wasn't just about finding weapons. It was about tearing down a hated symbol of the king's absolute, tyrannical power. But that brings up a really big question, right? Why this? Why now? How does an entire society get to this incredible breaking point? Well, to understand the explosion, we first have to understand the insane pressure that had been building up for decades. So, Act 1, France on the brink. Before the revolution, French society was structured under what was known as the old regime. And to put it bluntly, it was fundamentally broken, it was deeply unfair, and it was pushing the entire country right to the edge of collapse. So, when King Louis XVI took the throne back in 1774, he basically inherited a monarchy that was bankrupt. Just flat broke. Decades of war, including that very expensive decision to help the American colonies win their independence from Britain, had completely drained the treasury. The government was forced to take out massive loans, and by the late 1780s, it was spending a gigantic chunk of its budget just paying off the interest. The king really only had one solution: raise taxes. But the big question was, taxes on whom? You see, French society was rigidly divided into three groups, or estates. The first estate was the clergy, the second was the nobility. Now, together, they held most of the wealth and all of the power, but, and this is crucial, they were exempt from paying almost all taxes. The entire financial burden of the state, it fell on the third estate. And the sheer imbalance here is just staggering. The third estate wasn't some small minority. It was literally everyone else, from peasants and artisans to merchants and lawyers. They made up about 97% of the entire population, yet they were shouldering all the taxes and had basically no say in how the country was run. And if that wasn't bad enough, a series of bad harvests and a growing population caused the price of bread, the staple food for most people, to just skyrocket. Wages couldn't keep up, and many, many people were facing actual starvation. This is what's known as a subsistence crisis, where the very basics of survival are suddenly at risk. This popular etching from the time just brilliantly illustrates how the common people felt. They saw the nobility as this giant spider, sitting fat and comfortable, while the peasant was the fly, trapped in its web, just slowly being devoured. So the key takeaway here is that the system wasn't just seen as unfair. For millions of people, it was becoming truly unlivable. Okay, Act 2, the Declaration of Rights. Let's see how all this widespread misery started to transform into an organized movement for radical change. Because as all this anger was simmering across the country, new ideas, new philosophies about individual rights and the role of government started to really capture the public's imagination. And when change finally came, it came incredibly fast. In May of 1789, the king called a meeting of the Estates General to approve new taxes. But the third estate, demanding more voting power, found themselves locked out. So, undeterred, they gathered at a nearby tennis court and swore an oath, the famous tennis court oath, declaring themselves a national assembly and vowing not to stop until they had written a new constitution for France. Just a few weeks later, boom, the storming of the Bastille. That event showed the king that he was no longer dealing with a few scattered riots, but a full-blown popular revolt. Faced with the raw power of his subjects, Louis XVI had no choice but to officially recognize the National Assembly and accept that his absolute power was now going to be limited by a constitution. Then, in August, the Assembly issued its landmark document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, and this thing laid the foundation for the new world they wanted to build. It established that rights like liberty and equality were natural, inalienable. It declared that power comes from the people, not from a king, and that all citizens are equal before the law. This was an entirely new way of talking about politics. Act 3, Reign of Terror. But this initial wave of idealism, it wouldn't last. The dream of a constitutional monarchy pretty soon spiraled into a much darker, much more violent phase, as the revolution became more and more radical. In 1792, the monarchy was abolished completely, and France was declared a republic. The very next January, Louis XVI was put on trial for treason. He was found guilty and then executed by the guillotine. I mean, this single act sent shockwaves of horror and fear through every royal court in Europe. The revolution wasn't just about limiting the king's power anymore. It was about erasing the monarchy itself. Power then fell into the hands of the most radical faction, the Jacobins, led by the intense and uncompromising Maximilien Robespierre. Fearing enemies both inside and outside of France, his government began a policy of severe control and punishment to eliminate anyone considered an enemy of the Republic. And this brings us to the central, absolutely terrifying debate of this whole period. How do you defend a revolution that's built on liberty? On one side, you had revolutionaries like Camille Desmoulins arguing that liberty is about reason and justice, not mass execution. But on the other, you had Robespierre, who argued that terror was a necessary evil, a kind of swift, severe, and inflexible justice needed to protect the revolution from those who would destroy it. And this was not just some philosophical debate. An estimated 17,000 people were officially tried and executed by the guillotine during the period we now call the Reign of Terror. Thousands more died in prison without ever even facing a trial. The revolution, you see, began devouring its own, and eventually, in July 1794, Robespierre himself was arrested and sent to the guillotine. Act 4, the revolution's legacy. So after all that chaos, all the instability, all the bloodshed, what was left? What is the lasting legacy of this revolution from over 200 years ago? Well, in the short term, the end of the terror definitely did not bring stability. The weak and corrupt government that came next, called the Directory, just couldn't control the country. This political vacuum created the perfect opening for the rise of a brilliant and ambitious military general, Napoleon Bonaparte, who seized power and eventually crowned himself Emperor of France in 1804. Now, it might seem like the revolution had just come full circle, right? From one absolute ruler to another. But its most important legacy wasn't a stable government. It was a powerful set of ideas that, once they were out there, could not be uninvented. The concepts of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The idea that the people are sovereign, that no one is entitled to privilege just by birth. These ideals spread across Europe and inspired movements for democracy and independence for the next 2 centuries. The French Revolution proved that a society built on centuries of privilege and inequality could be torn down by its own people. But it also left us with a difficult, enduring question that, frankly, we still grapple with today. How do we achieve liberty? And what is the acceptable price to pay for it? Thanks for joining this explainer.